Is it blood spatter or is it blood splatter? It's spatter. Hi there, I'm Danny. I'm online and I'm trapped inside of your phone and behind your screen. Please let me out. I've been stuck in here for years now. I want to see my family. Please let me out. I have a bachelor's degree in criminal investigations, which is basically a combination of criminal justice, law, forensic science, all kind of mixed together. Forensic science and the fields of science within it are something that I've always been super passionate about. So I've decided to make this series for people like me who love all things gross, macabre, nasty, but from a scientific perspective. Alright, here's my good housekeeping stuff. For legal purposes, the information presented in this video should not be taken as legal or medical advice, and it does not equate to a formal education. It is for entertainment purposes only. All rights of sources are credited to their respective owners, and I list my sources that I use for the video in the description below if you are interested in checking them out or if you want to look at them. They're there, always. Another warning, this video contains potentially graphic or disturbing content. Some of the topics I will be talking about in this video could be triggering or upsetting for viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. And for this episode specifically, I want to tell you guys that there is a lot of heavy topics in this, since this is blood spatter. When things get bloody, they get really disturbing really fast. There's a lot of mentions of topics that can be really sensitive for people. So I'm going to try to put warnings beforehand and give you skip marks if you want to skip those things. I'm going to do my best, but just before we even get into it, just know that there is some sensitive content in here for real. Be safe. If you can't watch it, just click off. I won't be offended. It's okay. I get it. Let's get into it. It's time to get into our inner Dexter today because we're discussing blood spatter, which is one of my favorite topics, except for the math part, which we'll get into too. But it's a really fun category of forensic science. There's a whole lot of fun stuff here. It's really interesting how all different types of motion and velocity and how it translates to the patterns. It's kind of common sense, but it is interesting to kind of look at it and analyze it. And some of these things are really obvious, but also at the same time, I know when I was learning these things, it was like, I've never thought about it that way. You know, once you understand the basics of blood spatter analysis, a lot of things will fall into place and just make sense for crime scenes. It helps you understand everything so much better. This is like one of the major pillars, in my opinion, one of the major things that helps you understand and put together a crime scene, especially a murder scene. The blood spatter will tell you a lot. Let's have a bloody good time.
This guy stinks!
I had to, I'm sorry. We're talking about blood. It's necessary. It's necessary. Bloodstain evidence is a valuable and oftentimes essential tool for the investigation of crimes where blood has been shed. Bloodstains can be a deciding factor for apprehending a suspect in a case and obtaining a conviction. Bloodstain evidence is also often used to prove the innocence of suspects or defendants. This is really important stuff. Everyone who's familiar with crime scene investigation, and even people who are not super familiar with how it works, are familiar with the concept that physical evidence is much more reliable in court. This is for many reasons, including the CSI effect. Yes, like the show. The CSI, crime scene investigation, whatever. I never really watched it, but you know, the crime scene shows, those actually create a bias for juries. And I can make a whole video talking about this. I wrote a paper about it once. It's crazy. But if you want me to talk about that, please let me know. Basically, juries have this sort of bias from watching crime shows that make them believe that physical evidence is the only evidence that can truly prove whether or not someone is guilty. Obviously, this isn't true. There's a lot of stuff that can prove that someone is guilty, not just, we have the weapon right here. You know? And it can be really frustrating for forensic scientists and investigators and stuff when a jury is expecting, here's this extremely damning physical evidence, a hammer with their fingerprints on it. That's not always how it is. That's not how it is in a lot of cases. I hate to break it to you. We do not live in a movie. I wish we did. But you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot of other things and you can't just rely on physical evidence. But bloodstains are a really great source of physical evidence and something that you can show a jury and they'll be like, oh my god. My cat agrees. Yes. For some context and background before we get too deep into bloodstains, circumstantial evidence, which we talked about in my last video a little bit. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's all about the history and the background of forensic science. Kind of covers a little bit of everything. Circumstantial evidence revolves more around witness accounts of what people saw and knew about a suspect, and physical evidence is a physical, tangible object that you can touch and hold. Circumstantial evidence is, hey, I saw Bobby Joe at the store 5 hours before he was supposed to be hanging out with his wife. You know, affidavit, I saw this, stuff like that. Physical evidence is obviously physical objects. Obviously, physical evidence is better from a scientific perspective because you can test any substances, materials, or marks that are a part of the object and get answers as to what the substance is or what it came in contact with. However, without circumstantial evidence, it can be hard to construct a timeline and provide context as to why whatever happened. It's like you have this piece of evidence, you have these fingerprints on this soda can, and the same fingerprints are on a weapon that has blood all over it. Okay, but how did that happen? Like, how did we get to that point? And you can't always determine that with just physical evidence. Circumstantial evidence is really important. That's just the point that I'm making here. Please remember that. Back to the nasty stuff, the blood, the drip. Also, can we take a moment? This look that I did specifically for this, all bloody and gross. It's special effects makeup, it's not real, it's face paint. Okay, obviously, please, YouTube, be easy on me. But I feel like it's pretty obvious. But yeah, I like this look. And it took me a long time. Anyways, there are 3 basic things that you need to understand in order to get a grasp on interpreting bloodstain patterns. Number 1, the shape of individual bloodstains allow their origin to be determined in 3 dimensions. You can figure out exactly... Ooh. Hi. Hi. You can figure out pretty much exactly where the blood came from and how it ended up on whatever surface it landed on. Alright? Number 2, the size of individual bloodstains suggests what kind of energy was used to create them, if they were the result of an impact. There are many different ways you can get bloodstains, not just from swinging a weapon or something at someone. There's low, medium, and high velocity stains. I'll explain the specific differences in a bit. I'm going to get into a lot of detail with those, okay? I took a lot of notes on them. But just from telling you what they're called, I'm sure you have an idea of the amount of energy exerted to make each. It's pretty obvious, it's common sense, low, medium, high. You got it. 3. The distribution and concentration of the bloodstain pattern may suggest the distance between the origin of the blood and the surface on which it was deposited. This is important because it can provide valuable context to the bloodstains and how they were created. So here's a super short history lesson on bloodstain pattern interpretation, which involves animals. So if you are sensitive about animals being hurt or harmed, you might want to skip this part. I'll try to put the timestamp here or somewhere on the screen so you can skip to that part, but it does involve some animal stuff. So people are crazy. Here's your little history lesson on bloodstain pattern interpretation. There are well over 500 references to bloodstain pattern interpretation that were published before 1975. These references include reports from several murder cases. Obviously, when you have a murder, there's blood, and people were kind of like, let's analyze these. However, there was this guy, Dr. Edward Petrowski, who created one of the most comprehensive bloodstain pattern interpretation works in 1895. Yay! You know, before this, they didn't really have a lot of in-depth study done on bloodstain pattern interpretation. And the forensic community was kind of like, hey, this is a resource we really need. And Dr. Edward was like, I got you guys. I got you. And as you can imagine, you're probably thinking, well, how did he do that? Well, this guy, the way that he did this, and I'm laughing because I'm uncomfortable, not because it's funny or find it funny. This guy he had a room and he covered it in sheets of paper, and he would take a rabbit and bonk and analyze and preserve the bloodstain pattern that was created. And he specialized in blunt force trauma. This was all blunt force trauma, which is different from sharp force. But he did this with a bunch of different rabbits, and he preserved the bloodstains, and analyzed them and how they were created and the differences, and showed them to everyone and submitted it as a report, and everyone was like, this is a really good resource. Was it created ethically? No, not at all. Unfortunately, that is a lot of early science for you. They just let the intrusive thoughts win. Truly, that's what it is. Many other early forensic scientists recognized the value of studying bloodstains, but the subject was never really practiced. Judging on how Dr. Petrowski handled studying these stains, I think you can kind of make your own conclusion on why people didn't really study this in depth before this guy came along, because it was really unethical and hard to do. Bloodstain patterns weren't really studied in the US until Dr. Paul Leland Kirk and Dr. Samuel Shepard worked on a case together in 1955 where bloodstains were used in depth as evidence to help reconstruct a homicide scene. 1955. Like, are you kidding me? But like, this is recent history. It's crazy. In order to understand how bloodstains form, we need to talk about how blood behaves itself first, as a liquid. Blood is a liquid that behaves similarly to water. You know how water splashes, drips, pours, and splatters? That's essentially the same way as how blood behaves. However, since water is colorless, actually being able to distinguish bloodstain patterns and how they look from certain actions can be a bit hard at first. Like, you know how the water moves and reacts to these actions, but you don't know the pattern that it creates because water's clear, blood is red. Bloodstain analysis is primarily concerned with what happens to the blood after it leaves the body, which, common sense. I told you a lot of this is going to be common sense. A lot of forensic science overall is common sense. Just kind of writing it down and thinking about it first. It's a lot of things that are like, you know, when you're working on like a group project or something and you think you got everything, and then one of the people you're working with is like, oh, actually we forgot this. We forgot to create a slide on the main topic. And it's like, oh, how did we forget that? That's basically what forensic science is. Just a bunch of people who are like, hey, actually, yes, we understand how a liquid works, but water is clear and blood is red. So maybe we should start writing these patterns down. Yeah, you get it. When blood spatters, drips, or gushes, it is following the laws of physics, specifically the ones of ballistics, or projectiles in motion. Like all liquids, blood is held together by surface tension, which produces a force across the surface of a liquid that decreases its surface area. When a small volume of liquid like blood detaches from a main body of liquid, it creates a spherical shape, not a teardrop shape. In all caps on my notes. The teardrop shape is only going to appear after the surface tension is broken. This was really strongly emphasized in the book. Blood does not drip in a teardrop shape, it drops in a circle shape. The author was very serious about that. Artists, stop doing that. I do that in my own art, so I'm guilty of that. But another property that you have to consider with blood specifically is viscosity. The viscosity of blood is around the same as water, but increases greatly as it clots. It gets thicker. So that's specifically something that you have to look out for with blood clotting. Your typical drop of blood is going to be around 50 microliters. If the bleeding rate is rapid, the volume might increase a little bit, but not a whole lot. Slower bleeding does not result in drops with less volume. Most of your blood drops are going to be around the same amount. Blood is also not going to break up into smaller droplets as it falls through the air. The only way you're going to get a blood droplet to subdivide is if it hits a rough or dirty surface or some external force collides with it while it's in air. It's not just gonna like break apart on its own. Because of that surface tension, it's gonna be staying together in a little bowl. The amount of spatter and how the spatter looks is going to depend heavily on what the surface the blood is landing on and is like, rather than the distance that the blood is falling. So it doesn't matter if it's falling from way up here or way down here. If the surface is smooth, it's gonna have a similar shape. If the surface is rough, it's gonna spatter. You know, we'll get more into it in a little bit, but that's like the basic idea here. It's all about the texture of the surface. Generally, the harder and less porous the surface is, the less spatter you will see because of the relatively high surface tension. Ooh, here's a good visual. Imagine a water balloon being rubbed against a smooth countertop and another water balloon being rubbed against an old rough porch deck, you know, like sitting on your grandma's porch and it's kind of old and gray and there's some splinters and stuff. Imagine rubbing a water balloon on that versus a smooth granite countertop or something like that. It's going to break faster on that rough wooden surface compared to the nice flat smooth countertop. There are also a lot of factors that have to be considered between hard and soft porous surfaces. Imagine popping the same water balloons as before on a wooden board versus popping them on paper towels. The wood is harder than the paper towels, and there will be less spatter on the wood than there will be on the paper towels. And porous surfaces, they're going to absorb liquids. So wood is porous and it's going to absorb the liquid, but it's not going to absorb it as fast as the paper towel, and on the paper towel it's going to spread more. Imagine that your water balloons are filled up with grape juice. You know, that's your visual. It's going to be spreading on the paper towel and on the wood. It'll spread a little bit, but it's going to be more condensed. Estimates of a distance a drop of blood has fallen from the extent of spines from the central blood stain will usually be inaccurate if the surface texture is not considered. And spines are like those big spikes that come off of the dropped blood stains. You know what I'm talking about? Like they drop and they're kind of like the big spiky things. Those are spines. Alright, on to blood stain characteristics. There's a lot of math here, specifically trigonometry, which I failed and had to get a tutor for in 10th grade, so I'm going to keep this part brief and simple because that helps me understand it, and I'm sure it'll help you too, especially if you're not good at math like I am. The shape of bloodstains is produced when individual drops of blood strike a surface. They will either be round or elliptical. I think you know this, but if there's anyone out there who doesn't know what an elliptical is, it's more of like that. Think of, okay, round is M&M from the front, elliptical is M&M from the side. It's that oval shape. Their directionality may often be determined from the shape of the bloodstains, even when there are no spines or satellite spatters. One end of the eclipse shape on a flat surface will have a pointed end. This point indicates its forward direction of travel prior to impact. Okay. A smaller droplet may sometimes be thrown off from a larger parent drop upon impact. These little baby blood droplets are called cast off. On my makeup you can see I've got some cast off. Got the main spatter and then these little tiny droplets that are kind of, that's your cast off. The two-dimensional origin of a bloodstain pattern can be established by drawing straight lines through the long axis of the bloodstains. Where these lines intersect is the origin of the blood spatter. Think of those scenes in movies where they have the red strings crossing over the crime scene. That's what we're doing here, trying to find the origin. And that's also a genuine method that is used to determine the origin of blood spatter, but you're not going to do it first thing when you get there because that's going to destroy your evidence and everything. Always take pictures of everything first. Always. The actual origin of the blood spatter would be above this intersection point, so that's where the trigonometry comes in, and you create a three-dimensional model. So place a pole in the middle where they all intersect, all those strings that you set up, tying them together where they intersect, and it makes kind of a big cone shape, and that's going to be your initial impact point. Don't take my word for this section. I'm trying my best to tell you what I've learned and what I know about these things, but this is also math, so the actual trigonometry part of it, you're gonna have to look that up on your own. Blood that falls onto a flat surface that is not horizontal will create an elliptical shape, and the more the impact angle decreases from 90 degrees to 10 degrees, the more elongated the blood stain will be. So it'll be a nice long ellipse. If you're interested in seeing the impact angle formula, I'll put it here. But I don't know how to use this. I haven't used a formula like this since I had those fancy T84 calculators in high school that you like rented out and people would like draw on them and you get in trouble for it. Like draw with the map. You know what I'm saying? Graph points. So in reality, you would only start using the strings I mentioned before, after you've determined the impact angle and taken all the pictures you need from every angle with and without your scale, possibly taken samples or lifted prints and collected them as evidence. This is like the last thing you're gonna do because you're potentially destroying evidence and important parts of the scene. One of the major rules of criminal investigations is to preserve everything as it was to the best of your ability without destroying or interfering evidence. And using the strings could possibly mess up or destroy bloodstains, which is not good for your investigation, obviously, if you haven't taken the necessary steps I mentioned beforehand. The O.J. Simpson case is a huge example of this, of just fumbling everything evidence-wise and messing everything up, contaminating the whole scene. They used it as an example in all of my classes. Do not do this. The O.J. Simpson case is a great example of what not to do as an investigator. The size of your stain depends on how porous the surface the blood lands on is, the amount of blood that created the stain, and how wettable the surface the blood lands on is. By wettable, I mean will the blood actually wet the surface or not? I feel like that's not a great description. Think of a glass that has one half covered in grease or butter and the other half is clean, it doesn't have any grease on it. Blood will roll off of the greasy side, and on the clean side it's going to stay there and leave like a trail of blood as it rolls down. That's wetting the surface. Alright, now onto the different velocities. This is where it gets fun, in my opinion. Fun in a like morbid curiosity way, not fun in an actual way. Like the act of creating a blood stain is not fun. Low velocity impact is stuff like a slow drip or someone stepping into a puddle. Liquid to liquid, like blood dripping into a pool of blood, results in many small droplets being spattered upward and out, away from the center of the pool of liquid. When someone steps into a small pool of blood, blood will splash out from the point of impact and create a streak-like pattern, those big spikes radiating out from the original pool of blood. Since the energy can't go back up, it all goes out. It all shoots out, so you got these big streaks. Medium velocity impact is like human speed. That's what I like to call it, and that's what I've always thought of it as. What I mean by this is when you see a medium velocity impact spatter, it was usually caused by a beating, a stabbing, or another violent act. The force of these blows will have enough energy to break the blood's surface tension, releasing a lot of very small droplets. And these are usually actions that a human the speed that a human's moving at. It's important to know that your first blow is not going to create spatter. Spatter only happens when there is blood to spatter. Your first blow typically causes the injury that leads to blood pooling on the surface, and then that blood gets spattered. This is why with medium velocity impact spatter, you should always add an additional hit onto the amount that you count according to the spatters that are already there. As someone who has studied forensics, obviously this is something that annoys me a little bit in movies for realism. Obviously a lot of slasher films and stuff aren't going for that whole realism thing, but when a movie is really trying to be scary, they don't take that into consideration.
You need to leave!
The biggest example I'm thinking of is American Psycho, where he's like, "Hey, Paul!" and the first blow has all this blood go in his face. That's incredibly inaccurate. I'm being super nitpicky. I know that that's not just common knowledge, although it does feel like common sense, but as someone who has had that drilled into my head by my professors and stuff.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
It annoys me. Homicides due to beating are usually pretty characteristic because of the large amount of blood that spatters. There's usually more blood spatter from a beating than a stabbing, cutting, or shooting. An exception to this would be if someone took an axe or a baseball bat to the victim's head, which would cause a large amount of blood spatter. The people who are doing the beating are also being spattered with blood. The absence of blood from the accused's clothing does not prove their innocence. It's possible to beat someone without any back spatter. It's possible that the perpetrator was naked and then showered and all the blood came off. It's also possible that the perpetrator was wearing a raincoat and blasting Huey Lewis in the news while they were killing their victim. All these are realistic scenarios that might happen. Impact velocity associated with beatings and stabbings has been measured at about 25 feet per second. This is the range for medium velocity impact spatter. That's your human speed. Of course, there are some extreme situations such as beatings done with a golf club, which might produce high velocity impact spatter because the golf clubs can move so fast because they're built to move fast. They're kind of like aerodynamic. Beatings with golf clubs aren't common though, but it is important to remember the context of the crime when considering your spatter. That's where your circumstantial evidence comes in. Where did it happen? Where are you? If you're at a golf course and there's a bloody golf club, you know, and the accused was at the golf course during the time when this happened. There are two important rules that you must remember when trying to identify bloodstain patterns. The first is that a few bloodstains do not equal a pattern. A pattern is composed of many bloodstains. The more bloodstains you have, the more firm your conclusion will be. Obviously, the more you've got going on, the more solid your evidence and understanding of what happened is going to be. The second is that in most beatings, there's little, if any, blood spatter from the first blow. We already kind of talked about this, but it's a really important point. We talked about this a bit earlier, but your first blow is going to be the one that causes the wound and the actual bleeding to start. There can only be blood spatter if there is blood to spatter. On to our last category, high velocity impact spatter. This one is a wild one. When a considerable amount of energy is applied to blood, the result is a lot of extremely small droplets. The more energy you use, the more blood will spatter. High velocity impact spatter is characterized by looking almost like a mist, like really tiny, tiny droplets. There could be larger droplets also present in these types of spatters, but it's mostly going to be like a mist. That energy that you're using and the blood is moving so fast, and the surface tension is broken with such force that it's just like a mist, like that. If there is high velocity impact spatter on clothing or shoes or other objects, it means that those objects were close to the victim at the time of impact. So if there's high velocity spatter on someone's shoes that aren't the victim, that person had to be there when the shooting or the impact happened. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Trigger warning for this section, we're going to talk a bit about spatter with suicides in a case that kind of revolves around that. It'll be brief, but I'll tell you what to skip to if you don't want to hear this part. But it is like a specific pattern that's different from regular high velocity. When you see blood spattered upwards onto the ceiling, it is usually associated with a suicide. Spatter could also be present on the inside of the victim's shirt cuffs. Basically, if it's pointing up and towards the victim, kind of like this direction, the wound was probably self-inflicted. For example, Here's your case. There was a case where a woman was found with a near-contact gunshot wound on her right temple. The husband of the victim claimed that she accidentally shot herself, which that's a huge red flag in itself. Who says that? And that he got blood on his shirt while he was handling her body. However, according to the crime scene and the bloodstain pattern analysis, the victim had been shot on the floor, and the high-velocity spatter was found on the cuff of the right sleeve of the husband's shirt that was consistent with back spatter from a wound. The husband got convicted of second-degree murder. So yeah, if you have blood spatter on anything, and high-velocity blood spatter is so tiny and so distinguishable that you can't just be like, oh, it's from, I was holding the victim. No, you're not going to get away with it. It's important to remember that when blood is spattered as a result of high velocity impact, the fine mist does not travel very far. So if it's on you, you did it. Not necessarily. You were there. You were there. Kind of a side note, but the reason I'm saying velocity over energy is that we're looking at the speed of the spatter more than the energy used to create that. Like, yes, it takes more energy to create a high velocity spatter, but technically low velocity spatter can be made with the same amount of energy. The example in my source is a high velocity spatter made from a gunshot versus a low velocity spatter made from an elephant stepping in a pool of blood. They both technically have the same amount of energy used, but they will create different patterns. So that's why I'm saying velocity. On to bloodstain patterns resulting from projected blood. Projected blood happens in many different scenarios, like when an artery is breached, when blood is expirated through a cough, or when it flies off a weapon during a beating. Whew. The first type of projected blood stain we'll be talking about is arterial patterns, which are my favorite. Arteries use a lot of pressure to get your blood around your body, so when one of them is breached, it gushes out and makes a very specific pattern. You know how heart rate monitors have that kind of spiky up and down, sometimes it's waves pattern that shows, like, it visualizes your heartbeat? It's a lot like that, which I think is awesome. It's not awesome. It's not awesome that your artery got breached, but I think it's cool. You visualize the heartbeats. The blood that gushes from a breached artery comes out in spurts that match your heartbeat. So the pattern they create will look a lot like the arches you see on a heart rate monitor. Type 1 arterial is characterized by large blood stains with very elongated spines. The elongated spines indicate that the blood is coming out with a lot of energy, and the arches are usually very well defined. This is going to be a large open wound, like that artery is open and it's gushing. Okay, there's a lot of blood and it's very defined arches. And the spines are showing that it came out with a lot of force. It's like, you know. Type 2 arterial is characterized by large blood stains that are somewhat smaller than type 1 arterial, as well as having few, if any, spines. They usually result from a wound that restricts the clean projection of blood away from the victim's body. So your artery is still breached, but it's not as big of a wound. It's not like a big open wound. It's just kind of like, it's still a wound, but you didn't like fully open that artery up like you did with a type 1. Type 3 arterial can be difficult to recognize because it's composed of smaller drops of blood and it looks more shaky. These types of arterial sprays are caused by an artery that has been breached, but it's still covered with overlapping tissue that makes it hard for the blood to escape. There's much more pressure because the wound that it's coming out of is much smaller than the other examples. So this is like your artery has been breached, but there's just like a tiny little hole that the blood can come out of. So the way that they look is there's still the arches, but the blood is in all these tiny little droplets and it's kind of moving like this, like shaky arches. Cast-off blood stain patterns are made when blood that is on a weapon flies off as it is swung back and forth. So think, sorry, I got my hair all in my lip gloss. Think of a weapon that already has blood on it, and you move it back and it's kind of like, and you move it forward. If you move it forward with enough force, it'll also go, you know, so it's like, and you're also picking up more blood each time. X-rated blood patterns are when blood accumulates in the airways and is blown out through the nose or the mouth. These bloodstains appear to be medium or high velocity impact stains, so the origin of these is very important for context. If there's a high velocity impact stain on someone's hand, but their hand was found in front of their mouth, it's more likely that the stain was made by the person expirating blood than a high velocity impact blow. It's more common sense based than anything, but you know, if you see someone like this and there's like a high velocity type blood stain, it's probably because they coughed it out. Transfer bloodstains are when a mirror image is reproduced onto a surface after contact with blood is made. Think of somebody stepping into a pool of blood and then leaving bloody footprints. That's the basic example of a transfer. Transfers can also happen by swiping the blood with your hand or hair, or having something so soaked with blood that when you push it against the surface, it kind of leaves a mark or an imprint, like a stamp. Like if you had your hair, it kind of leaves the texture of your hair against the wall, kind of like that. I also want to take a minute to talk about void patterns, because these are also really cool and really important. Void patterns occur when a bloodstain pattern is created in front of another object, and when the object is moved, a void is left because the blood did not originally hit that space. If someone was shot in front of a lamp, you're going to have the spatter, and then the lamp is moved, there will be a lamp-shaped blank space on the wall, and the blood stain will be around it. Of course, with every crime scene, you want to take as many pictures as possible with and without scales. Take samples, preserve as much as you can for evidence. You do not want to skimp on anything, like have as many people as possible go over it before you start cleaning things up. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you like this episode, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified whenever I upload a new video, and follow me on all of my socials, which I list in the description below and also at the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. See you next time. Danny is offline. That was a fun one. I like that one.